In the 2040s, the Tantalus base was established on Mars. A crew of 8 astronauts embarked on a 6-month mission to gather samples, and today is their last day. In just 19 hours, the spacecraft Aurora will arrive from Earth to pick them up. In the Martian desert, Vincent and Rebecca drove a rover towards an excavation site, noticing an incoming sandstorm. Once they arrived, Vincent radioed Kim, urging her to return to the base and prepare for departure. But Kim, desperate to find valuable samples, ignored his call and continued digging. As they waited, Vincent confided in Rebecca that he was tired of Kim's attitude and wasn't looking forward to the 6-month return trip, despite his eagerness to be home. When Kim finally joined them in the rover, she griped about going back empty-handed, lamenting that 6 months hadn't been enough time. During their drive back, they received a call from Captain Charles, who urgently asked them to hurry as they needed assistance fixing the communications link with the Aurora. At the base, Richard managed to restore the signal, but also had to address the power issues caused by the storm. Meanwhile, Marco requested one last trip to the excavation site from Charles, as he needed to repair a broken gamma sensor. Charles was hesitant, but eventually agreed, telling Marco to take Richard along and return before nightfall. When the trio arrived, they saw Marco and Richard leaving, which prompted Kim to complain that it wasn't fair she had to return while the others got to go out again. On the way to the site, Richard was shocked to learn that Marco had lied. They weren't going to fix anything, but rather to collect a sample of something called a microscopic anomaly. Back at the base, Vincent repaired the cooling system while chatting with psychologist Robert. He had noticed the Aurora's erratic approach trajectory and thought it looked like drunk driving. Kim checked Marco's workstation and discovered an image of cavities on a rock, which Rebecca identified as microbial borings. Examining the sample under a microscope, they found signs of bacterial cell division, realizing Marco had lied to avoid sharing the credit. Angered, Charles called Marco and Richard, declaring the excavation site off-limits. Marco, however, told Richard to pretend he couldn't hear Charles due to a poor signal. Marco then took a soil sample, but as he examined it, the ground suddenly collapsed, trapping him underground. Richard rushed out to help, but the steam made it difficult to see. After Richard called for backup, Charles and Lauren arrived to rescue Marco. While Richard believed Marco was dead, Lauren disagreed and attempted to descend into the pit. Charles immediately stopped Lauren, stating the pit was too dangerous in its current condition. They decided Lauren would stay behind to keep watch, while Charles and Richard returned to the base to gather proper rescue gear. At the base, Kim told Charles she wanted to announce their discovery. Richard pointed out that Marco had died, but Kim felt it was his own fault for disregarding protocol, angering Richard. The group contacted Mission Control, who had seen the report and granted them permission to attempt a rescue, despite the risks. Before leaving, Robert wanted Charles to reprimand Kim for her behavior, as Marco's death wasn't his fault, but Charles said every crew mistake was ultimately his responsibility. As Charles, Rebecca, Robert, and Vincent headed back to the site, Lauren waited in the rover. Suddenly, she heard someone trying to enter the vehicle and attempted to inform Charles via radio, but the storm interference prevented him from hearing her. When the team arrived at the excavation site, they found Lauren had vanished. Assuming she had fallen into the pit, Vincent strapped himself to a rope and descended. As he neared the bottom, he noticed a microbial organism growing on the rock formation. However, the further he went, the more he began to hyperventilate, having flashbacks to his past accidental entrapment on the Aurora. Recognizing his distress, the others quickly pulled him back up. After taking a moment to calm down, Vincent reported he hadn't seen anyone in the pit. However, Robert then noticed 2 sets of footprints leading back towards the base, which puzzled the team since they could have simply taken the rover. The team called Kim, who warned that if Marco's suit was damaged, he could be suffering from oxygen deprivation and brain damage. At that moment, Richard checked the tracking system and spotted 2 figures 50 meters from the base. As Kim tried to make radio contact, Richard went to the airlock to let them in. As Kim spotted a strange figure approaching the base, Richard opened the airlock, and Marco collapsed inside with a hole in his helmet. Removing the helmet, Richard recoiled in shock at Marco's now zombie-like appearance. Suddenly, Marco stood up, grabbed an electric drill, and stabbed Richard in the gut before the injured man could trigger the alarm. Kim rushed to the airlock, but fled in terror when she saw Marco. Lauren then reached the airlock, revealing she too had been infected. Clutching his wound, Richard fled into another room and locked the door behind him. Lauren went after the fleeing Kim, who fought the creatures as best she could, using anything she could find. One creature became distracted, allowing Kim to knock the other down and escape, locking that door as well. Before passing out, Richard managed to radio, "Mayday!" When the others returned, Charles told them to wait outside while he investigated the mess inside. Finding Kim, he ordered her to suit up as Marco began breaking through the glass door. Charles tried reasoning with the infected Marco, but the creature's altered brain seemed impervious to words. Once suited up, Kim left the base as Charles rushed to the airlock. The infected astronauts caught up to him, stabbing his shoulder, but he managed to join the others. They disabled the door to trap their transformed crewmates, despite Vincent's objections. Kim showed the group the creature's inhuman faces, convincing them. The crew hid in the greenhouse dome, where Rebecca tended to Charles's wound as best she could. Realizing he was dying, Charles grew sad that he couldn't recall his family's faces, asking the team to convey his final thoughts to them. In a sudden outburst, Charles grabbed Robert by the neck, forcing the others to restrain and calm him. As Charles struggled to breathe, he told the crew they'd never see home again before passing out. Thinking Charles dead, Vincent covered the body, but Kim quickly tied him down in case of reanimation, upsetting Vincent. As they debated their next move, Vincent lifted the blanket, horrified to see the infection spreading. Moments later, an explosion outside drew their attention to the monitors. The infected astronauts had escaped the airlock using explosives. As the creatures reached the dome, pounding on the door, Charles's body suddenly convulsed. Unable to contact the space station due to disabled communications, Vincent volunteered to traverse the oxygen pipe and return to the base to repair the system. After Vincent departed, Rebecca drew a blood sample from Charles, discovering he too was infected. Crawling through the pipe, Vincent succumbed to a panic attack, haunted by past trauma, but Rebecca talked him down over the radio. Reaching the base, Vincent found it covered in blood, but set to work. Back in the dome, Rebecca wondered if antibiotics could counter the infection, injecting Charles. His body began convulsing, and Rebecca hoped this meant he was fighting the disease. However, Kim noted the body's movements were merely reflexes, not signs of fighting the infection. Rebecca's next blood test revealed the bacteria had stopped multiplying, indicating the solution slowed but didn't cure it. Kim prepared to vaporize the formula into a decontamination spray to use against the creatures. Meanwhile, Vincent contacted Aurora, but before he could explain the situation, a power failure occurred. Robert then spotted the infected crew members returning to the base, unable to breach the dome. The team resolved to lure the infected inward, spraying them with the decontamination formula in the airlock. While effective initially, Rebecca soon discovered the bacteria developing resistance to the medicine. Journeying to restore power, Vincent encountered the infected Richard, bludgeoning him repeatedly to no avail. Retreating through the pipe, Vincent warned Rebecca he hadn't sealed the other end, prompting the crew to don their helmets before extracting him. As Richard advanced, Kim grabbed antibiotic bottles, hurling them at the creature. Vincent and Rebecca raced to open the airlock, hoping to escape. Seeing Charles' reanimating body, Robert fled, locking the door and leaving Kim to the creature's attack. Rejoining Vincent and Rebecca, Robert reported Kim's fate. In the airlock, the sprayed creature stirred, prompting Robert to kick it in anger. The trio opened the airlock and fled, but their infected former comrade stabbed Rebecca in the leg with scissors. Vincent quickly administered antibiotics, hoping to aid her fight against the infection. Setting off in the rover, the group soon realized they lacked sufficient power to reach the landing site. Unable to drive the full distance, they'd have to walk, which Rebecca's injury prevented. Vincent proposed taking her to the base for treatment, but Robert argued they should abandon her, as she was infected. Rebecca countered that Robert may also be infected. Recalling another rover at the excavation site, they diverted there. Reaching it, Robert set out on foot to retrieve it, then contacted Vincent, demanding he leave Rebecca behind. When Vincent refused, Robert fled alone. By the time Vincent reached him, it was too late to stop him. Worse yet, Vincent spotted the infected closing in, so he and Rebecca fled in the rover through a sandstorm, hoping to lose them. Vincent believed they'd have enough power to reach the landing site by morning, once the rover recharged in the sun. Meanwhile, the Aurora had departed the space station, en route to Mars. Come morning, Vincent found a message. A rescue team was on the way. But his attempt to respond went unheard by the space station. Realizing Rebecca had left the rover, Vincent followed her tracks, eventually finding her. She warned him to stay back, feeling the infection's effects. Desperate, Vincent ran to her, and she removed her helmet, dying from suffocation. Within minutes, her body reanimated, attacking Vincent. Rebecca begged him to end her suffering, and with a heavy heart, Vincent bashed her head with a rock. Spotting the approaching Aurora, Vincent raced to the landing site, but 3 infected creatures were closing in. He desperately tried to warn the rescue team not to disembark, but the storm's interference prevented them from hearing. As soon as the team emerged, the creatures attacked, their agonized cries audible to Vincent over the radio. Continuing onward, Vincent found the creatures feasting on the rescue party, but they remained unaware of his presence. Approaching the landing site, Vincent discovered a gruesome, rotting corpse. Entering the ship, he found the self-aware but infected Robert in the cockpit. Arguing they couldn't risk bringing the bacteria to Earth, Vincent was attacked by Robert. In the ensuing struggle, Robert stabbed Vincent's helmet. As the ship launched itself, the men fought, with Vincent eventually headbutting Robert unconscious. Removing his own blood-stained helmet, Vincent ejected Robert's body into space. In his final moments, Vincent imagined Rebecca's comforting presence. Afterwards, he sent the station a message detailing the events, acknowledging his possible infection. Resolving to crash the ship on Mars should symptoms appear, he awaited their response as the Aurora continued its journey.
Hello.